Hi everyone, I'm Mary Feeney. I'm a professor here at the School of Public Affairs. I'm the Lincoln Professor of Ethics and Public Affairs here at ASU. Welcome to ASU or Phoenix and to the Super Bowl, depending on where you're from. I'm here today to talk a little bit about the NFL as a nonprofit organization. Many of you may or may not know that the NFL is a nonprofit organization, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means for the NFL and for American society. So in general, when we think about nonprofit organizations, I think most of you probably think about these types of nonprofit organizations. NPR, the YMCA, the local sort of food bank here in Phoenix, St. Mary's Food Bank, right? We think about what the IRS classifies as public charities. These are organizations that do good, they provide public goods or public services, and they receive some tax exemption for that from the US government. So the IRS classifies organizations based on the type of nonprofit status that they have. Of the 2 million organizations that apply for nonprofit status with the IRS, 1.6 million of those classify as public charities. That is this type of organization. The NFL, in comparison, is what we call a 501c6. There are about 77,000 of these types of organizations in the United States, and they fall under this other type of IRS code. This code specifies these organizations that serve as business leagues and business associations, which aim to advance the interests of a collective industry, a business, or in the case of, for example, chambers of commerce, a collective geographic area. Some examples of 501c6s that you might be familiar with are the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association, and of course the local Chamber of Commerce. In 1966, the NFL became a nonprofit under this statute of the IRS code. The code was amended to add this line, and professional football leagues, so that the NFL would qualify as a nonprofit in order to prevent it from being challenged for antitrust litigation, because the National Football League and the American Football League were joined together. And it was also in an attempt to protect the pension funds and the insurance funds that the organization was using to protect football players. Okay, so the NFL has been classified as a 501c6 since 1966, and it includes a variety of organizations within the NFL. The NFL as an association for nonprofit status includes the NFL Charities, the NFL Management Council, and a trust that provides insurance to players and alumni. Its membership includes the 32 NFL teams that all of you are familiar with. So there's currently been some debate about whether the NFL should stay a nonprofit or if it should be considered a for-profit organization. I think many of you can sort of understand intuitively why it seems like a for-profit organization, right? It's a billion-dollar industry with multi-million-dollar salaries for players and teams, right? The teams are for-profit organizations. The association they belong to, the NFL, is a not-for-profit organization. So it's basically the club they sign up for that makes it nonprofit. The catch here is that the NFL, so when we talk about whether the NFL should be a nonprofit or not, it's important that we also include other organizations that function as nonprofits. The PGA and the NHL are also nonprofit associations. And so you might think, well, maybe professional sports associations need to be nonprofits in order to deliver the great array of public services they provide to America, right? They provide entertainment, they provide wonderful salaries for certain people, and they provide a lot of sort of goodwill among Americans. However, let's keep in mind that two of the other major sporting organizations in the US, the MLB and the NBA, do not file for nonprofit status. Their associations operate as purely for-profit organizations. So there's been this controversy in the public policy world about whether or not the NFL should be able to maintain its nonprofit status. One of the leaders sort of fighting towards ending the nonprofit status of the NFL is a senator from Oklahoma, Senator Tom Coburn, who has filed a petition called the Pro Sports Act. It has over 200,000 signatures that are asking for the US government to remove the Football Association from this category of business associations. But obviously 200,000 signatures is not really a huge amount of public support to change the IRS tax code. And maybe that support is explained by the fact that there are 32 states, large cities, and communities that are in love with their football teams. So there's a lot of sort of public support for the NFL, regardless of its tax status. But what I'd like to do now is sort of move away from talking about the NFL and talk a little bit about what it means to be a 501c6 and why these associations serve an important service as nonprofit organizations. So for example, I'd like to talk about the AAU. It's the American Association of Universities. ASU is a member of this association. It is a large international association that represents the interests of large research institutions, research universities, both in the United States and abroad. It has about 60 members, and what those members do to belong is they pay dues. So in 2010, the dues were about $80,000 to be an annual member of the AAU. In exchange for your membership dues, the AAU provides a variety of services to its members. So it provides this to all of the 60 universities that it represents. The services include raising the prestige of these organizations. It's very prestigious to be a member of the AAU. It means you're a top research university. It's something that many universities work very hard to become a member of. It's a reputation issue. Second, the AAU lobbies on behalf of its member organizations in Washington, D.C. So whenever there's legislation that might affect federal funding for research grants or for research sort of funding to scientists, the AAU is there to fight on behalf of all of its members. And finally, the AAU holds 2 annual meetings that the members are allowed to go to. So how does membership work? You have to be invited to the AAU. The association extends an invitation to a university that it thinks meets the qualifications for its prestige. And if 3/4 of the members agree to the invitation being extended, that member can join the AAU after paying its membership fees. This is very similar to the way other associations of this type work. The National Realtors Association, the American Bar Association, for example, the National Restaurant Association. A variety of organizations in that field will pay dues to be represented on a larger scale. It's a little bit like collective bargaining, right? They're not unions, but they're associations that advance your interests. The NFL, in comparison, includes a membership of only 32 teams. It is not open to membership from any of the variety of football leagues that actually exist in the United States and Canada and other parts of North America. It does not include arena football, women's football, indoor league football, or even the Fall Experimental Football League, which was started last fall. It is the minor league for the NFL. They are not represented by the NFL Association. These are all the types of organizations that could benefit from a nonprofit association that was lobbying on behalf of their interests and advancing the interests of the sport. But instead, the NFL Association only serves the 32 members that currently belong to the NFL. So what do the 32 members do to belong to the NFL? Well, they pay dues. So similar to ASU paying $80,000 about a year to join the AAU, NFL teams pay around $10.2 million a year in membership fees to the NFL Association. So the NFL Association is raising a lot of money through membership dues. And so then you have to sort of ask, well, what else does the NFL Association get besides membership dues? Well, what they get from the IRS and from the US, from the American people, is tax exemption. So when the NFL holds events, like they're holding here in Arizona this weekend, they are not subject to a number of sales taxes, including state and county excise taxes, gasoline and motor fuel taxes, county auto rental excise tax, county food and beverage tax, and innkeeper's taxes. So anyone making purchases on behalf of the NFL Association in those categories is not paying those excise taxes this weekend. So there's a sort of another layer of benefits that come with this nonprofit status. So this is the way the association benefits from nonprofit status. But what do the members get? What do they get for their $10 million a year to join the NFL Association? Well, the NFL Association has a number of costs that they sort of cover. They pay for their rents. They pay for the officiating crews at all of the different games. They pay the salaries of all of the leadership in the NFL Association. That's the CEO, the CFO, a number of sort of high-ranking organizers in the NFL. But most important, the NFL distributes the revenue they get from their dues and fines and other sources back to the 32 teams in the form of low-interest loans. So one of the things that makes nonprofits different from for-profit organizations is that nonprofits are not allowed to distribute their revenue to private shareholders. In this case, what the association is doing is distributing revenue via low-interest loans to the teams. And most of those loans are used for stadium building. So one of the things that gets most of the coverage when people want to talk about how appalling it is that the NFL is a nonprofit association is people turn to looking at the tax forms and they criticize the salary paid to the commissioner of the NFL. The commissioner of NFL makes about $44 million a year, or that's what he's reported. This is $44 million out of the $318 million in expenses that the NFL is reporting. So it's 1/6 of their expenses is this man's salary. And I think it could very well be argued that Roger Goodell earns his salary, that in a multi-billion-dollar organization, $44 million in comparison isn't really a substantial amount of money. But what it is in the nonprofit sector is a huge amount of money. If we look at the 20 most highly paid nonprofit CEOs in the United States, and we sum their salaries, we don't reach the salary of the commissioner of the NFL. These large, highly paid CEOs are typically coming from large research universities or museums. For example, the Shedd Aquarium in Chicago, the University of Chicago, Northeastern University, Goodwill Industries. These CEOs are making around $3 million a year. And they're very well paid nonprofit CEOs. So you can really see the comparison when it comes to salaries. And many people really criticize the NFL for having nonprofit status with this in mind. This is partly because the IRS tax code requires that nonprofit CEOs should receive a reasonable salary. It's one of the conditions of maintaining your IRS tax-exempt status. So while the salary continues to get a lot of attention in the media, when you look at articles about the nonprofit status, this tends to be what people focus on. What's really more interesting, I think, is when we look at the distribution of the assets of the NFL. So in 2012, the NFL reported a total of $822 million in assets. Their assets are $822 million. Of that $822 million, $621 million are in the form of loans. So really 70% of the business that the NFL Association is in is loan financing. That's where they're making their money and that's where they're spending their money. And I think one of the major criticisms that we find here is that the NFL League's primary business is loan financing. And that's not normally what Americans think about when they think about nonprofits and the reason why nonprofits have tax-exempt status in our country. So some have argued that that the NFL should lose its nonprofit status and that this would really change the way things are happening in the NFL's world. Well, some studies have been done to look at what would happen if the NFL lost its tax-exempt status. And really they estimate that it would result in revenue to the federal government, to the IRS, of about $109 million over 10 years. So only about $10 million a year in taxes is what the government's losing out on. So really, we're not talking about a huge amount of money for the IRS to be getting back if the NFL were to lose the status. $100 million is not really that much money for the NFL. It's not that much money in comparison to a $44 million salary or $822 million in assets, right? But it's a lot of money when we compare it to other nonprofit organizations. So for example, the American Kidney Foundation and Youth Villages, they make $70 million in revenues in an entire year. And they're quite large nonprofit organizations. In fact, these three nonprofit organizations listed here report a revenue of about 200 to 250 million a year. And these are the 48th, 49th, 50th largest nonprofits in the country when we compare it to public charities. So 109 million might not be a lot in the grand scheme of the NFL budget, but it's a substantial amount of money for public charities in this country. And this really gets to the heart of why a lot of people feel some tension when we talk about the NFL as a nonprofit. Because people in America think about this when they think about nonprofits. And they're thinking about sort of public goods and public service delivery. So if we think beyond this consideration of, oh, well, the NFL as a nonprofit really doesn't result in a huge amount of tax loss to the US government, so we don't really need to change this policy. But the more important thing is not the IRS and whether the IRS is getting money, but it's actually to sort of think about the other things that would happen if we were to remove the tax-exempt status for the NFL. First of all, team contributions to the NFL Association, the $10 million that they spend every year, would no longer be a tax deduction for these for-profit teams. Second, the commissioner would likely continue to make $44 million, whether they're a nonprofit or not. But it would mean that his compensation was no longer generated from tax-free membership dues. So that salary would be paid by dollars that people are paying taxes on. And finally, the NFL teams themselves would be required, like the rest of the for-profit world, to finance their building with using market rate loans and not getting these sort of very generous low interest loans from the NFL Association. But I think most important, removing the NFL nonprofit status, it won't raise a lot of money for the IRS, and it won't break the bank for the NFL. But what it would do is it would align the nonprofit tax-exempt status that Americans value with our views of what these kinds of organizations should be doing in our society. It would level the playing field for professional sports association, which would result in the NFL looking a lot more like the NBA and the MLB, and a lot less like the Alzheimer's Association. Thank you.